大家好，欢迎来到致富视野，开启您的视野，富足您的人生。今天给大家带来的演讲是功能医学先驱 Dr. Jeffrey Bland。2年前受 TED 邀请，以简单易懂的表达方式来诠释基因表现与健康之间的关系，揭示人们可以透过改变饮食、习惯和环境等方式影响基因的表现，进而改变自己健康情况的演说。因为当初原片没有中文字幕，所以本片加上中文字幕，以利华语系观众观赏。Dr. Jeffrey Bland 的著作中译本，书名为《功能医学圣经：全面战胜慢性病》，由天下生活出版社发行。我会将 Dr. Jeffrey Bland 官网及著作中译本连结放在资讯栏。另一个制作功能医学系列的原因，起因于本人去年9月一次体检，得知糖化血色素高达 8.7， 被告知得了糖尿病，需采取适配治疗。因为先前已对功能医学稍有认识，当下决定先采用不吃药的做法，从生活形态及膳食改善着手，搭配适量运动及营养补给品。半年后顺利减重15公斤，再次检查，同一数据已降至 5.9， 其他血脂相关数据皆恢复正常。深感功能医学功效强大，故加以推广。影片开播前告知，本人不是专业医疗人员，如有身体不适的情形，恳请尽速寻求专业医疗协助。
I'd like to tell you about an adventure story. It's actually your adventure story that's in your genes. This is an extraordinary story, and it's one that unfolds over the course of your life to give you what you want. You know, your genes really represent part of your book of life. Your book of life is actually encoded in 23 chapters, half of each chapter written by your biological mother, the other half by your biological father. We call those the 23 pairs of chromosomes. Within those chromosomes resides thousands of stories, and those stories are your genes. But they're not all read simultaneously, because if they were, you'd be a mess. Rather, they're read selectively, and that's called genetic expression. And what you're going to learn is this adventure story, which is in your book of life, can be anything you want it to be. It can be a book of adventure that is associated with empathic, passionate, extraordinary experiences, or it can be a book that's encoded and it's associated with tragedy and disturbance and inflammation. All of those messages, all those stories are encoded within your book of life. The question is, which of those are going to be expressed? You know, when I was young, and through my 74 years of living now, I recognize in reflection that my sister and I were kind of influenced by a concept that my father used to tell us, that his parents had died at a young age, and so he expected to die at a young age. So-called genetic determinism. There's nothing he could really do about it. It's the bad luck of the draw. And so my sister and I grew up with that concept of genetic determinism, that how we would grow older and our health as we grow older would be determined almost exclusively by our genetic inheritance. That's fallacious. The 21st century model has entirely thrown over that concept of genetic determination. Now we recognize only about 30% of our health is actually locked directly into our genes. The other 70% of our health is determined by what messages we send to our genes, what we wash over our genes in terms of experience, in terms of our environment, in terms of our lifestyle and the selections that we make. This unfolds and opens up the chance for our journey, our adventure story, to be that which we want it to be, and not a journey that's associated with premature disease. And in fact, one of the things that we've learned is that the food that we eat is actually information that speaks to our genes. Isn't that hard to believe? food is information for our genes, but yes, that's actually been found, and it opens up a field that's only about 20 years old called nutrigenomics. How food and its principles, the protein, carbohydrate, fats, vitamins, minerals, the phytonutrients that are in our plant foods all regulate and experience their effects on our genes that regulate our function. Wow, what a powerful concept. So how do we know this? Well, one way we know it is by studying identical twins, because when identical twins are born, as you know, they have identical genes. And as a consequence, you would expect as they grow older, then they should have identical health outcomes if in fact all of our health is determined by our genes. But that's not the case. Unless those identical twins lived in the same environment, ate the same foods, lived the same lifestyle, had the same experiences, what you will find in the research that's been done on thousands of pairs of identical twins over the last 20 years is that over time their health diverges. It differs one from the other. It differs because there are different experiences that are washing over the genes that create different genetic expression that then make them look, act, and feel differently. And in fact, that is then something that's above the genes that's called epigenomics or epigenetics, above the genes, something that's creating a different outcome from our genes. Now, the great example of that are the Pima Indians. Now, really, there's two kind of groups of Pima Indians. There are the North American Pima Indians that live in the southwest of the United States, generally on the reservation in Arizona. And then there are the northern Mexican Pimas. Now, they're genetically virtually identical. However, their outcomes in terms of their health are vastly different. It was noticed by the Indian Health Services and the Bureau of Indian Affairs a number of years ago that diabetes was increasing dramatically in the Pima Indians, such that by the time they become 40 years of age or older, almost 50% of them have some form of diabetes. You have kidney problems, you have neurological problems, you have problems with the eyes, and this is where you actually go if you want to study diabetes, is in this population. And so people started to say they have diabetic genes because they get such frequent diabetes. But yet if you look at the same genetics that are in the Mexican Pima Indians, you'll find that not 50% of them or more are diabetic, but less than 5% of them are diabetic. It's very infrequent. And the difference has not to do with their genes, it has to do with their lifestyles. Once we started giving the Pimas in North America white sugar, white flour, white fat, alcohol in abundance, the diets of too much of too little, overconsumptive undernutrition, they started showing the problems of obesity and diabetes. The genes were actually warrior genes. The genes were actually there to protect them from the historic greater risk they had, which was starvation. And so what has been found is they have thrifty genes that hold on to calories very tightly. But if you feed them these diets that are so rich in high calorie, low nutrient foods, now you suddenly produce a problem. So do we really have bad genes? And the answer is no, really. We have unique genes. Unique genes that define our unique relationship with the environment. Even those genes that we're worried a little bit about, like ApoE4 and Alzheimer's, or the BRCA genes with regard to breast and ovarian cancer or prostate cancer in men. These genes, which a lot of people don't even want to know if they have these genes being expressed, these mutant genes, really can inform us as to how we might best lead our lives if we do have those genes. We might want to know not to eat a lot of saturated fat, stay away from inflammatory foods, get more exercise, maintain our body weight properly, because the data says that if you know that information about your genes and you do those right things in your lifestyle, you can greatly reduce the expression of those genes into those diseases that we're so worried about. Even breast and ovarian cancer. This came from work of Mary Claire King a number of years ago, the woman who discovered the BRCA1 and 2 genes. So this concept of genetic determinism is really fallacious. We have tremendous opportunities to create our own outcome, even in those cases of what we call the genetic diseases of infancy. Diseases like sickle cell anemia, Down syndrome, phenylketonuria. These are very serious diseases. They're called monogenetic diseases because they're controlled by a single gene. And a lot of people said, well, there's nothing you can do about them. But now we recognize over the last 20 years of research that their expression also can be modified. There can be very mild cases of Down syndrome There can be hardly any adverse effects of phenylketonuria if the infant is put on the right kind of diet that's phenylalanine amino acid restricted, and it doesn't then impair their neurological development. These are the extraordinary new developments that we're saying, that genes are not bad or good. Genes define our uniqueness. And our opportunity is to learn our uniqueness and then modify our lifestyle, our diet, and environment in such a way as to maximize our adventure story to be all that we want it to be. So let me go back to my father. Remember, I told you he was kind of a genetic determinist. My sister and I were imprinted with that concept. So when he got into his 70s, he started to have some health problems. He was adversely affecting his life. My mother and he were unable to do the kind of things they'd love to do. Even his greatest love, which was his computer, he was no longer able to get onto it and do the programming that he so loved. And so it was a very tragic situation. So my mother called me and says, "So Jeff, is there anything we can do for your father?" And I said, well, this is early on in genetic testing. I said, well, let's have his genes tested to see what they look like. And when we did it, we found out that he had a unique genetic characteristic producing very high levels of homocysteine, an amino acid in his body. And when we measured that in the blood, lo and behold, it was high. But we know what to do with that particular condition. Once we got that genetic information, we know by giving him higher doses of vitamin B12 and vitamin B6 and folic acid that we can modify the way folic acid then and B6 and B12 affects the appearance of homocysteine in his body. And lo and behold, it worked. My mother calls me one morning and she is just excited as can be, exalted. She says, "Jeff, I'm so excited. This morning for the first time in 2 years, your father walked in the bedroom fully dressed, ready to go and saying, 'Let's go on a picnic today.'" And for the next 4 years, my father had a high functioning life. He got back on his computer, he got back into independent living, and it was like a miracle. It wasn't a miracle, it was understanding his genes and need that led him into the appropriate approach toward his health. That is an extraordinary adventure story that we might call miraculous, but by understanding our genetic heritage and understanding the treasures that it encodes, we can do magic things in our outcome and make our life that which we want it to be. So if I was to then kind of encapsulate all of this into a single takeaway, what does it really mean to us? Number one, have your genes analyzed. Don't be fearful of what they'll say. You should be empowered by recognizing that those are unique facets of your inheritance, the most important thing you'll ever own. You are like no other organism that's ever been made before, nor will again. You're unique. Identify then the strengths in your genes. Don't worry about those weaknesses. Worry about the things that actually give you greater resilience, greater flexibility, greater opportunity to maximize your potential. And then from that, create a future that maximizes your genetic gifts. In so doing, your life will be a true adventure story of a century or more high-level living. Thanks so much for listening.
感谢收看。如果你喜欢这部影片，请按赞、订阅、加分享，并开启小铃铛。新频道成立，需要您的大力支持与鼓励。任何看法、建议，欢迎在下方留言。如有想要添加中文字幕的功能医学相关影片，都可以留下连结给我。再次感谢，我们下次见。